Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to my weekly live chat. I am so glad you are joining me. I have some good stuff in store for you today. I have a giveaway. I'm going to tell you about my new website, and I'm going to talk about how I quilted a quilt for Tula Pink and kind of give you a little peek behind the process. So if you're watching live, Jessica is here as normal, monitoring the chat. She'll write down any questions you might have, and I'll answer them at the end. And we're just going to have a great time. If you are not watching live, no worries. You can leave your questions in the comment, and I will try to get to those from time to time. But I also know that quilters are really generous in sharing with their information. First of all, a giveaway. So we have a brand new product at Quilting is My Therapy, and I thought, you know what, why not do a little giveaway? So if you're watching live, leave a comment on there and Jessica will pick a winner at the end. And so what I'm giving away is a Touchdown Table Runner Kit. Now, I love fall for multiple reasons. It's just the best season. I love the pumpkin spice lattes and football, American football that is. And so we thought it'd be fun to have a little football themed runner that you can, celebrate the games and have fun with it. So it actually starts with a panel. So I designed this panel to look like a football field. So, you don't have to do all the piecing and all the applique, and even included a couple footballs that you can, embellish your runner with or turn into coasters. And I made the end zone red, but you can change that out too and have some different colors. So I have some examples, some quilted samples of that. So this is actually the shop sample. All the kits come with the letter templates, so you can change the name at the end of your end zone. I'm from Kansas City. Of course, I'm a big Chiefs fan, so I'm going to put the Chiefs there. But you could definitely embellish that with whatever you like. In fact, if the professional football is not your thing, you're more of a high school or college football, look at that. You can just switch out the color of the end zone and change the letters. So it's just a fun little quilt kit that we're going to give away, and one lucky winner will get it. If you don't win and you still want to celebrate football, you can check the link in the description box and check that out and get that sent to you. So that's the giveaway there. Secondly, exciting news, we just launched our brand new website. So it still is quiltingismytherapy.com, but if you go check it out, it should look different than it did just the last time we had the live chat. It's funny, last week it had just launched and crashed. So right as I went live, it was like, ooh, don't go there yet, but now it's up and super exciting. I'll have the capability to have online classes, and hopefully it should run smoother and be a little bit more organized. So check that out and see what that looks like. It's kind of like having a baby. Making a website took 2 years, so I'm just so glad it's here. And there's still some glitches to work out, but it's still great. So anyway, in last week's live chat, somebody asked a really great question. They asked, how do I quilt designs that cross multiple quilting areas, such as feathers? And the whole idea being, how do you approach these quilts that have bigger areas than your throat space if you're on a long arm, or even on a sewing machine? Maybe you don't want to, move the quilt a whole lot. So I thought, I'll make that its own topic. And it just so happened I realized I never talked about the Queen of Diamonds Block of the Month quilt that I did for Tula. So that just happens to perfectly fit our topic today. So I'm going to show you kind of some breakdowns of how I went about quilting it. But what I want to point out is it doesn't have to be done any certain way, right? I like to break it up and make it as efficient as possible. But ultimately, you're going to try some different things and find your own groove. So this is just how I quilted the quilt. It's definitely not the only way to do it. So first of all, I don't know what my problem is. I never get a good flat shot of her quilts. So this is about the only flat-ish shot. It was just kind of draped over the long arm there, but you can kind of get an idea of what that quilt looks like. Now, I'm going to be speaking specifically about quilting this on a long arm because that's what I did. But even if you're watching this and you're like, oh, I don't use a long arm, I don't have that problem, well, just know you can apply these techniques to your quilts so that you're not repositioning and moving the quilt back and forth a big amount of time. So it can be helpful for you even if you don't have the long arm quilting machine. So when we look at this quilt, and I didn't get a good unquilted picture of it either, so I'm kind of wishing I had done that, but we can see that these blocks are nice and large. And it's like a sampler quilt, so each block is different, which is a lot of fun, and I'll talk about picking designs for that. But this particular quilt, those blocks were too large for the throat space of my long arm. I quilt on a Handy Quilter Avante. It has an 18-inch throat, which means I can get about 16 inches comfortably within that throat space. So if we were to look at just a different quilt on a machine, for those of you that aren't familiar with a long arm, this will give you kind of a good example of that. When I'm working down my quilts, I'm working kind of in rows. right? So quilting a design that's going to cross multiple rows is not super easy. I have to advance the quilt back and forth, which is not the end of the world, but I like to be efficient with my quilting. So I try to change the way I approach the quilt in those situations. So when I get into a situation like that, there's a couple things I'll do. First of all, I'm going to kind of assess how much can I actually quilt. This red kind of box is just giving you like a somewhat visual representation of how much of that quilt I could really fit within my throat space. Those white sashings were just a little too big for the throat space. So that means if I quilt each white sashing by itself, I'm echoing, advancing, just back and forth. And advancing doesn't take that long, but I do have to stop, walk to the end of the quilt, into the machine, move it back and forth. It takes a little bit longer and it kind of breaks up my flow. One thing I know about myself is I'm easily distractible. So if I stop quilting, chances are I'm going to find myself on Facebook or, organizing my fabric, doing anything else besides what I should be doing. So I knew right off the bat that I was going to have to approach these blocks a little bit differently. Now, one thing I want to point out is for some of you on a long arm that use a long arm might be thinking, oh, well, you can turn the quilt on its side. And I definitely could have done that. But I knew that if I turned it on its side, I'd have a lot of different thread changes within each row. So it was kind of weighing my options. Do I want to change thread a lot or have to change up the way I quilt the designs? So I opted to change the way I quilted the designs. So when you're looking in this situation, again, whether in a long arm or a sewing machine, there's several options available to you. The first one is I'm going to pick designs that don't require a lot of passes or a lot of moving back and forth. So if we look at the feather that I chose to do here, this sashing was just like 4 inches big, probably 4 inches, just a little too small for anything too ornate. And so I decided to use some echo lines and then put a feather on the inside. Now, you might be sitting here thinking, well, if you're trying to make it efficient, why would you add echo lines? I'm still going to try to quilt the quilt the way I want to. I'm not talking about doing the quickest job possible, because if that were the case, I would just do a swirl over the whole thing. So yeah, I threw in some echo lines. It added a couple steps, but I love how it highlights the blocks and just separates it. Definitely could have left that out, but it's for Tula Pink, so I like to go a little all out. But if you've ever seen pictures of my work, or if you've ever even participated in the Feathers Free Motion Challenge quilting along, you might notice this looks a little different. This feather doesn't have a spine or an echoed spine in the center. You might be like, well, what are you talking about? So glad you asked. If you look at these feathers, these are usually the type of feathers I like to quilt, where I have that spine and have that echo. I love having that spine, a little bit separate the sides. I think it just looks pretty. But the problem with this kind of feather is I have to quilt one side of the spine and then the petals and another side of the spine and the petals. And that's really 4 different passes if you think of it that way. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Instead, if I leave out that echo line, I can quilt both sides of the feather at the same time. Now, I actually kind of touched on this in an earlier video for the Feathers Free Motion Challenge, but I didn't have a good example. Now I finally have a good example of that. So let's look at that feather. Instead of quilting all those separate steps, I can quilt my spine and add a couple of petals on one side, if you can see here at the bottom, and then switch right on over to the other side. So as I'm working my way up along that feather, I'm just quilting those petals on both sides so that when I get to the top, I'm done with the feather. Now I should pause right here and just kind of say, I tend to overthink my quilting, and you might be like, oh my gosh, that is too much to think about. I'm just gonna move the quilt back and forth, and that's totally fine. Sometimes when I start saying stuff out loud, I realize kind of how neurotic it can kind of sound. But that's why I picked that style of feather, because I knew I could do it in less passes back and forth. Another thing I did, I decided I needed a good way to transition from sashing to sashing, and so I picked this design for those smaller diamonds. You can see the circle around it there. Now, I'm assuming you might be thinking, oh my gosh, Angela, what an amazing design. You're so talented. I mean, that's kind of what I'm imagining you're saying. But I picked that design for a specific reason. Those diagonal lines allowed me to transition in between my white strips. Okay, so I'm going to show you what that looks like, and you can kind of see a little bit of the method of my madness. So here's a picture of the quilting. I just put some rough diagrams on there to hopefully help you visualize it. But what I did is I didn't do each individual white section. I didn't do each white section at a time. I echoed one side of all the blocks all the way across and did it again. So I'm kind of filling everything in equally. I could have totally did it a different way, and I probably would have if the whole thing would have fit in my throat space. But in this instance, it allowed me to be more efficient with it. So starting from one side, I echoed until I got to that smaller diamond, and then I used that dot-to-dot quilting to move to the other side and continue on. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'm working my way across the quilt, adding those echo lines. Again, it sounds kind of neurotic when I say it out loud. And then I worked my way back on the other side. Now I can advance my quilt just that extra inch or two and do the other side of it. So using the quilting designs to help me transition so I don't have to tie off and start a new line of quilting. Now I should probably also point out that when I started long arming, my very first long arm did not even have a needle up and down button. It had a flywheel on the front that I had to like crank every time I wanted to pull up the thread. So I got really adverse to starting and stopping a new line of quilting. Now it's no big deal. So I think it's just like the post-traumatic tying off disorder that I had from earlier quilts, but I try not to tie off as much as possible. So doing it all in one chunk, using the quilting to transfer between the lines just really helps me not have to do that. So I worked my way across, and this kind of is just a random picture I had snapped, lets you see kind of that process. So here I am, just a couple steps into that, adding the echo lines and then coming back and adding the feathers. You can see that, diamond design in that smaller diamond is helping me transfer over. Well, now I've got my echo lines. It's time to quilt my feathers, which I could totally do each feather, but I'm sticking with the same idea of progressing my way across the quilt. So I quilted the spine of my feathers, used traveling to help me move to the next side, and continued on. So then I came back and added the petals of my feather. Now, I love you all, but I didn't want to take forever doing the diagrams of all those little petals. So pretend that that's what there are. So you can see I used that diamond design, and I started adding the petals to my feather, working my way up to the top, and then continuing on to the other side. So that's kind of how I broke it up and made it a little bit easier to quilt. So instead of advancing back and forth, I chose designs that maybe let me work my way around it. Now let's talk about the borders of the diamonds. So when I started the quilt, this was the top block. I think the top and bottom have half blocks, which can be very deceiving because they fit just so nicely in my throat space, but the other ones don't. So I actually started echoing that lighter purple border in there, and I'm like, oh, this is actually not going to be a great idea for the whole blocks because I'd have to advance, come down, and there's no way to transition between the lines. I'd have to tie off for each block and start a new line. So I decided, I'll do the half blocks this way, but I'm going to switch it and do something different in the other blocks. And you can kind of see in the purple strips, I opted for a bracket kind of curvier shape. That really took me a while to figure out what to do in that spot. It was about an inch sashing or an inch border, which is too big to leave unquilted, but not big enough to put a lot of stuff in. So I kind of went back and forth, and finally it was like, you know what, I'm going to do brackets. That's going to work. The reason I went with that is it gives me somewhat of an echoed kind of look, but it allows me to transition from one side of the block to the other. Again, this is just me kind of overthinking it, but hey, I love to do it. So you can see on this block, I started where that red arrow is. That's where I started my first bracket line, working my way along that border. So quilting up and then down to the other side. What I'm doing is instead of looking at that block as a whole block, I'm breaking it in half and quilting it in halves. So working my way across the area, quilting the top halves of my blocks. So quilting brackets over there and then coming back, working my way back. That's actually why I have that echo line in there. I could have just did one row of brackets, but it needed a little bit more quilting. And I also knew that by coming back, I can then quilt inside the block and move my way to the next one. So did the top half, came back, and then filled in the block, moved on to the next one. So it's just looking at that quilt and changing up the way I'm approaching it. Again, if you're working on a sewing machine, you can move that quilt in any direction. You can go as far as you want, but sometimes it's not very fun to reposition that quilt. So this would be a way to, go about handling it slightly different and making it a little bit more manageable. So once I got that done, I kind of decided how to do that. I was on a roll. Now, don't think that I just started the quilt and knew exactly where to go and when. It took me a row to kind of figure out where to go and how to progress. I like to say the first, 25% of the quilt takes 75% of the time to quilt, because you're just figuring out the path and the way you're going to go. But once I got into that groove, I figured it out, then I could just, jam through the rest of the quilt. Now, like I said, I love quilting things over the top. I love doing it efficiently, but I will change thread colors if it's necessary. I will add some echo lines if necessary. I'm not trying to, do the easiest job. I'm just trying to do the job I want to do in the most efficient way. Now, one of the fun things about quilting sampler quilts is that every block is different. Isn't that so fun? It's like you finally get the hang of one block and then you get to change it up for the next one. I actually really like quilting these kinds of quilts because they keep me engaged. They're different challenges with each block and a lot of fun. So this really has nothing to do with efficiently quilting your way through an area, but when I'm looking at a quilt, if the fabric is the most important thing or the pattern is the most important thing, I love to use the quilting to highlight that. Now, for Tula, always her fabric is the most important thing. And stuff like this in this star where she fussy cuts out the striped diamonds and then pieces it together so they match, like, blows my mind. I want to be able to do that. I just don't want to work so hard to be able to do that. So when she had blocks like that where the fabrics came together, I definitely kind of highlighted that in that area. So the busier fabrics, like the little kitty cats, just going around some of those elements, quilting around some of those fussy cut details that she put in there. Nothing too crazy or over the top, just kind of highlighting her beautiful, beautiful work. Another block right here, little kitty cat. The little hearts, just going around the outline of that. I love this because she's already done the difficult work. I just get the easy job of tracing along it. So when you're looking at those, sampler quilts, go around some of the details in them. Now, in the blocks that maybe don't have details to go around, or there's kind of supplementary blocks, still equally as important, but not maybe the focal. I love to use dot-to-dot quilting and continuous curve. So you can see those geometric shapes in those diamonds and those triangles. It's just great because it works in a lot of different shapes and a lot of different ways. So I can kind of reuse it over and over again. So here you can see a little bit of that geometric look, but then also kind of combining it with some continuous curve, such as in here. So crazy. Again, the fussy cutting that she does is just astounding. So again, in each block, just kind of letting the block speak to me, trying to use continuous curve or dot-to-dot designs in different ways to really highlight the blocks. And this one, it's kind of hard to see, but it has the serpent print, and I kind of went around the details of that print. And even in those little corner diamonds, there's a little hourglass kind of shape. Too small to really quilt around the detail, so just doing a little kind of teardrop around it just helps highlight it. So in those areas, I'm just having fun, definitely not overthinking it too much, and more here. So again, how I approach a quilt is going to be different with every quilt. It's different with every machine. Hopefully it gives you a little peek in the process. But another thing I like to do, and it just so happens I found another Tula pink quilt to talk about, her Space Dust quilt. Now this is one from back in the day, one of the first quilts I ever quilted for her, and I love to show this in my online trunk shows. I know I've used it during the live chat before, but she gave this quilt to me and told me it looked like a spaceship. So of course I had to add details in there. So when I was looking at this quilt, I really wanted to quilt these straight lines. Don't laugh too much at my diagrams there. It's just so you can visualize. I wanted these lines to look like they were kind of coming out from behind, like, it just landed or something. And you can tell on the very middle, the top, and on the sides, they're fine. I could fit that space within the throat of my machine. The problem is when we get to the diagonals, that's going to be too long for my throat space. So for each line, I'd have to advance the quilt and then move back and forth. And I would do that for Tula, but sometimes using other designs to break up those big areas can make it easier. So I took the easy way out and quilted a bunch of swirls in the corner. Now it did fit the overall look of the quilt because I had swirls coming out like smoke, and it's like they wrapped off and then came back on. But can you guess why I would do something like that? It takes that longer area, breaks it up into a smaller chunk so I can then come back in and add those lines. So the designs I pick may look like I'm trying to be creative, but I'm probably just trying to be lazy or using other designs to break up the area and make it easier. Now, you just kind of have to know what is easier for you, and the more you quilt, the more you'll find, what works for you, but definitely a great option there. Now, on the other side, I decided to switch it up. Instead of putting swirls, I quilted like a little star with, like it was falling, like a little shooting star. Well, what that just does is it takes that longer area and just breaks it up so I can then transition between the lines. Really, the thing to remember is when you're looking at your quilts, you can go about quilting them however you want, but there are things to do that can make it a little bit easier, whether it's quilting the designs in different arrangements, using designs to break up that space, or picking designs that will be more efficient to quilt. Now, how do you know if it's going to be more efficient? Every time you quilt a quilt, you learn something new. You either learn what to do or what not to do next time. So hopefully this is giving you some ideas on what to think about when quilting those bigger areas of your quilt. Now, I'm sure there were some questions. Looks like Jessica has a pile for me. There was a question that came up on the type chat. I love to get on the live chat about a half an hour before I go live, and we kind of chat each other. Quilt Gal asked, when I'm tying off or starting a new line of quilting, do I go back and forth over my stitches, or do I tack it in place? I like to just tack it in place. So I'll pull up my bobbin thread, and I just take a few stitches in place to help kind of secure that and then quilt on. But you can do whatever you want. That's just how I handle it. So I like to say I'm only the expert of my opinion. So there is that. Thank you, ma'am. It's kind of fun, reliving all the quilts I do for Tula, because I can remember usually like the audiobook I was listening to then or what was going on. How can we see the new challenge on your website? So the new challenge isn't up yet. I'm hoping to announce it in the next couple weeks. I did give a sneak peek of it last week, so you can check out that last live chat if you want to check it out. But it's going to be all about swirls, and I'm really looking forward to that. How big are the diamonds? I have an APQS Millie 26-inch throat space. That probably would have worked. I didn't measure them. They're about yay big. I don't know. They're bigger than 18 inches. I'm not sure exactly how big they were. Do I have a suggestion for how not to have a large quilt hang on various corners? I'm guessing maybe like when you're quilting on your sewing machine and it's hanging everywhere, that's the pain because it's gravity's pulling down. So you're just gonna pull it all together. You're gonna throw it over your shoulder. You're gonna wad it up. You're gonna do the smush and push, whatever it takes. I think I have, one thing I like to use are quilt clips. I think I have some, oh yeah. So here, if you take your quilt and kind of roll it up, you can use this clip to kind of hold it together. But the main idea is don't let it lay out and spread flat. Just kind of get that up on your area. So that helps you don't want to fight gravity with that. It's hard enough to quilt without the quilt pulling on you. So hopefully that helps. Does Tula ever request anything specific in the quilting? Back in the day, yeah, she would kind of be very specific about what she wanted, or we would talk through it. But now it's kind of like, here's the quilt. All right, thanks, and I send it back. Now, I am working on a quilt for her right now, and she did say, ooh, the center would be great for some of your great quilting. So she will let me know what the most important thing is, or kind of what she's trying to get with it, but she never gives me design ideas. She lets me kind of pick it, which is pretty nice. But I mean, if she did, it'd be fine. But like we're kind of like married, it feels like. We've been together a long time. Haley, my youngest daughter, I was pregnant with her when I started quilting for Tula, and Haley is now 15. So I've done plenty of quilts. I know what she likes. I know, how to make her happy, and that's a lot of fun. Is it better to have a busier backing than a solid color? Does one show more of the quilting than the other? It depends. I love solid backings because it's like 2 quilts for the price of 1. You can see the quilting on the front and the back. If that scares you, or you're like, oh, I don't want that to happen, you can use a busier fabric. So when I'm working on, let's say Tula's quilts, that space dust quilt, I quilted all that background in a light, I'm just gonna say light yellow thread. I'm gonna use the same bobbin color. So if I have a backing on there, it's a solid black, you're really gonna see the quilting on the back. Now, when that happens, I would just tell the customer I'm not charging them for the extra quilt, but just know that if you want to, you can just use a different fabric on the back. When I stitch in the ditch around a shape and then realize you miss a spot, do I reload the quilt to fix it? No. So stitching in the ditch, stitching along that seam, and you could see in those diagrams that I posted, I'm kind of hitting part of the seams and then not others. I usually end up getting it all at some point, but I'm not too worried about it. Stitching in the ditch helps me transition from block to block, and I'm trying to hit it all, but if I miss a little part, I'm definitely not going to worry about it. When you step back and you see the whole overall quilt, it's going to look fine. Now, this is just what I do. Don't do this and enter a show and expect to win a ribbon, right? That's a totally different thing than show quilting. So hopefully that makes sense. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed seeing a little bit into the process. If you have any questions, again, you can leave them in the comments. But we have our winner of the Touchdown Football Runner Kit. Judy Kavanaugh is our winner. So Judy, email us at customerservice@quiltingismytherapy.com. Give us your address and we'll get that sent out to you. And if you didn't win, so sorry, but you could check out the link in the description box and get your hands on a kit yourself. And if you're watching this and if you've liked any of the tips or pictures or time I put into the live chats, I hope you'll give the video a thumbs up. It just helps other quilters find it as well. Well, I'll be back next week with another live chat at Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.